the way to do this is very simply to kind of divide the power line and then conquer each parts of the power individually. Like that's the strategy. Sales Ascension, what's up? Sean here. So excited to be here with you today for another high ticket tune-up. Today we got just a banger question that comes in from Julie. And Julie says to us, she asks, Sean, what do you do when a prospect says, I have to ask my team to get approval? Now, this typically happens in the buying process stage of the sales call, right? So if you're not discussing what we call the buying process with your prospects, that's something that you definitely want to consider strongly. It's actually stage 5 in our system that we use. You know, like I guess I can answer this best by going back and sharing a personal story about when I was in the roofing world. I used to sell roofing material. I was selling to, you know, school districts and county buildings and government buildings and then like big commercial buildings. And I would actually sell the roofing material. After I've gotten a client to say yes to the roofing material, then what I would help them with is I would orchestrate like a multiple bid competitive bidding situation. Then I would put the bids together from the contractors, and I'd put my material inside of the bids, and then we would present that to the prospect, and then they would make a decision. A lot of the time I had to deal with these facility managers, and I would come into these buildings. I used to use this one all the time. I'll share kind of like the way to do this is very simply to kind of divide the power line and then conquer each parts of the power individually. Like that's the strategy. And so how you deploy that, right? So in my world, I was selling to these facilities managers, and I would go to, and we would discuss like, hey, yes, they are in need of a new roof, or they need to make some major repairs to their roof. Then I would say, great, well, you know, is this something you can do? He'd be like, well, hey, Sean, I have to go ask my team to get approval. And I was like, great. Perfect. You totally should do that, right? So like the first move is just agree with them. Don't disagree, because if you disagree, then you're going to be banging on either side of the table. So I would always just agree. I would say, hey, listen, like you're right. You do need to ask your team. You do need to get approval for this, because this is probably a little bit more than the budget that you have allocated that you can personally spend, right? And he would say yes. And then I immediately would say this. Well, listen, you know, all things aside, if this decision was purely up to you, would you be willing to make the investment yourself? And when I got him to say yes, that was the secret, right? Because now it's like this. Okay, great. I totally agree. You need to go ask your team. You need to get approval from everybody else. We need to figure the budget out. We need to figure out some other things, but you would make the decision yourself. And they would say yes. And I would say, great. Now that we've gotten you, you know, and now we're on board together, right? We've locked arms. It's different than any other sales move that you'll probably hear of, is like, agree with them and then say, now we're locked arms, because instead of doing this, now you've actually swung yourself around onto this side of the table. And then now the job is to say, who besides yourself is involved in the buying process? Who is the team that you have to get approval from? Who are the individual people? And you start dissecting that part of the conversation. Then all of the players will come out, because now it's like, hey, we got to, like, you and I agree that we want to work together. Like, let's just figure out the details. Who else besides yourself is part of the buying decision or buying process? And then you'll say, well, this guy, or that girl. And we'll say, great, tell me about them. And we got into that part of the conversation. And then I would say back to the facilities manager, I would say, listen, how do we get Joe and Cindy and Steve on board with us the same way you're on board with me right now? How do we do that? I would ask him to help me get into those conversations with each individual person. The disconnect and a lot of sales are lost. Where are sales lost here is when that person would say, oh, I got to go talk to my team, or I got to talk to my spouse, or I got to go get approval from my boss, or whatever the case may be. They then are responsible for selling to that person. And most people internally don't understand that there's an entire sales process that goes on inside of a company. We need to help the prospect be able to sell internally into their organization. So instead of just getting one person on board with you, which would, in my case, would have been the facilities manager, it's like, okay, now you're on board. How do we get Joe on board? How do we get Cindy on board? How do we get Steve on board? Just start having the conversation with the facility manager. Say, listen, when you go talk to Joe, what's he going to say? Oh, he's going to say this, this, and this. Okay, great. What are you going to reply with? How are you going to talk? Let's talk about that for a second. Give your what we call the white horse little bullets in his gun or her gun, so he can go back internally and actually have a really valid conversation, because we've anticipated what Joe's going to say. We've anticipated what Cindy's going to say, and we anticipated what Steve's going to say. You just help that facility in my case, it was a facility manager. In your case, it would be a prospect. But you just help them have those internal conversations and get through the hoops and the red tape that they need to cut. When you do this, you have faster acceptance, you have lower resistance, and you hit the buying action threshold way faster, right? So this is because now this facility manager, you've gone through you've walked with him or her through the entire process. Now they think, oh my God, like you have a solution to my problem. You've not only helped me with the solution to my problem, I'm totally on board with you. And now you're helping me get everybody else make my job easier to get them all on board so we can move forward. And they subconsciously are going to be like, whoa, that's so powerful. They won't know this, but this is what's happening in the brain. They're thinking, man, this guy is like, he's the real deal or she's the real deal when you're speaking with them. And then deals will just start to fall down. So depending on how big the sale amount is how many people are going to be involved. So the more dollars, typically there's more cast of characters inside the process. So we just have to identify all of the people that are involved with making the decision and then get the first person on board and help that person then help get all the other people on board with you and just kind of coach them through the conversations that they got to have. At the end, we just make sure we focus on a clear future, saying, okay, so we're going to get Joe and Cindy and Steve on board. Grab your calendar. When's the next time we should meet? Just book the next call. That could be the end of like call one, depending on how big the sale is, and then book the next call. And then you say, hey, listen, if Joe or Cindy or Steve want to be in this meeting next time, please bring them. I would love to meet them. Sometimes people ask like, hey, will those 3 other people be in this next meeting? That's going to be valuable because that will speed the process. If we plant that seed in the prospect's mind, then he or she, when she goes back to sell internally, will keep that in their memory. And typically it will accelerate your sales process, meaning you'll have less actual process steps to take, like less calls to make. It will collapse time frame with your cycle. Sales cycle is the time from initial contact to close deal. So it will shrink that, which is also a definite benefit. And then you now have created what we call the white horse inside of an organization, where that person now is responsible for getting everybody else on board, and that becomes kind of your point person. They call him the pivot man or whoever it is going to be. And it's like in baseball, they call him the pivot man, right? It's the cutoff man. So the outfielder throws to the one person, and that one person is responsible for pivoting around and throwing it to anywhere else that the ball needs to go. Same thing in sales is like your prospect becomes your pivot person inside that organization, and you just have to help them with their sprinkler approach to sell everybody inside and then get them on board. And then now more deals will start to happen. And I hope this helped you today for a high ticket tune-up. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week, and we will talk soon.